parte do projeto temático que é apoiado pela FAPESP. E, como coordenadora desse projeto, eu gostaria inicialmente de apresentá-lo no que ele interessa, antes de passar a palavra para os outros. É uma investigação das atividades e construção de carreira dos nossos dirigentes, nas quais a socialização para exercê-las passa cada vez mais pelo mundo internacional, ou melhor, pelas disputas no campo do poder internacional, travada pelos que pretendem deter o monopólio de dizer quais as melhores formas de se inserir nas transformações sociais em curso. Dessa maneira, o projeto, no lugar de perguntar quem tem o melhor argumento para expressar o sentido da globalização, os pesquisadores reunidos neste grupo, neste projeto, buscam entender quem está competindo para definir o significado dessa palavra globalização. O objetivo final é construir um miolo central da produção dos quadros dominantes brasileiros, com o olhar voltado para os dois lados da questão. Os que realizaram uma grande carreira para além das fronteiras nacionais e as carreiras realizadas somente no âmbito nacional. Isso tem nos permitido uma reflexão mais fina sobre a barreira tão discreta quanto intransponível que parece existir nos campos profissionais dos estados periféricos, entre uma elite que ascende pela grande porta de um título internacional e com isso reivindica para si os cargos de autoridade, e todos aqueles que, possuidores de um diploma local, estariam tendo dificuldade de alavancar a carreira. Trabalham nesse projeto pesquisadores de várias universidades do Brasil e pesquisadores franceses, e os presentes são os consultores internacionais do projeto. Sobre a constituição dessa rede, o Afrânio Garcia, que é o mentor do projeto, vai discorrer em seguida. As exposições subsequentes servirão para mostrar a importância que damos ao trabalho empírico, teoricamente construído, tanto sobre os agentes quanto sobre a constituição dos grupos envolvidos no projeto da globalização. Acreditamos que esse método de trabalho pode ajudar a trazer mais luz para a compreensão desse poderoso dispositivo hegemônico que tende a se tornar o lugar central da reprodução das elites nacionais. Passo a palavra para o Afrânio.
Bom, vocês já viram a generosidade toda. Bom, primeiro, quero agradecer aqui imensamente o convite da Ampox e ao Marcelo Ridente, que tem sempre apoiado muito todas as atividades feitas na França, sobretudo no caso do CRBC, e da Letícia Canedo, que está aqui na condição, inclusive, de coordenadora desse projeto da FAPESP. Como houve uma mudança da mesa redonda até agora para o momento da conferência, nós vimos que havia um tempo mais reduzido. Então, com isso, houve uma redistribuição e até aquilo, por exemplo, que eu ia apresentar como pesquisa direta, eu posso deixar até, porque, na verdade, esse grupo funciona de uma maneira que é a seguinte, quer dizer, esse grupo está construído a partir dos anos de 2000, na prática por pesquisadores franceses e brasileiros, e desde o início ele vem tentando problematizar as questões ligadas à mundialização através dos seus agentes concretos, quer dizer, quem são os indivíduos que tecem as redes, tanto as redes sociais quanto as redes cognitivas, que dão sentido a essa transformação das realidades nacionais, locais e internacionais. Bom, então, essa rede de pesquisa composta por pesquisadores franceses e brasileiros trata, sobretudo, dessa questão dos agentes da mundialização sobre as condições sociais e intelectuais de suas práticas. Nós começamos até de uma maneira muito concreta. Graças a Letícia Canedo, foi feito um trabalho de recuperação da listagem dos bolsistas brasileiros desde os anos 50, de CAPES, CNPq e FAPESP, e depois foram cruzados os dados dos bolsistas com os currículos Lattes hoje existentes. Então, esse banco de dados é um banco de dados com muita riqueza, que ele permite efetivamente trabalhar a trajetória dos indivíduos e ter os dados sólidos sobre o momento da sua saída. Esse é o banco de dados construído no Brasil, e havia um banco de dados construído na França, que era o conjunto de teses defendidas sobre o Brasil na França, e hoje em dia se tenta fazer isso a nível europeu. Bom, então havia a constituição de bancos de dados, e ao mesmo tempo, em toda a equipe, tanto de pesquisadores sêniores como novos pesquisadores, teses e doutorados, haver pesquisas individuais que fossem convergentes. Então, no Brasil, articulava pesquisadores da Unicamp, da Universidade Federal de São Carlos, da Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul, da Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais e do CPDOC. E, no caso francês, tinha pesquisadores ligados à Escola de Altos Estudos, do CERDC, do Centro de Sociologia Europeia, do Centro de Estudos de Movimentos Sociais e de um grupo de país 5, que é o CERLIS. Bom, nós tentamos fazer uma série de publicações anuais, elas estão depois disponíveis, e atualmente até estamos acabando, está um número no Prelo, que é exatamente o fato de nós estarmos estudando como as pessoas que foram como essa circulação internacional foi decisiva na transformação de determinados campos do conhecimento, no caso brasileiro. Então, por exemplo, aí tem tantas coisas de saberes de Estado. Então, essa revista tem, por exemplo, um estudo sobre direito, sobre economia e finanças, ciência política, a retórica e a problemática para pensar o sistema educativo, e tem também uma parte de outras disciplinas mais ligadas à área de ciências sociais e humanas, como a antropologia social, a teologia e um estudo sobre como os indivíduos concretos que circularam, quer dizer, qual a vivência das pessoas na passagem pelo exterior. Particularmente, eu mesmo que venho, de toda a minha formação, do curso de antropologia do Museu Nacional, ao realizar esse trabalho, fui aos arquivos do Museu Nacional para estudar a trajetória concreta dos pais fundadores, e fiquei extremamente surpreso até das coisas que se podiam articular e novidades da minha própria história que eu desconhecia, que essa prova de uma atividade reflexiva me permitia. Esse texto vai estar disponível, então eu não vou tratar dele aqui para poder, porque a Unpox dá então uma oportunidade de nós fazermos o seguinte: nós apresentarmos ao mesmo tempo esse grupo de pesquisas que se constituiu desde 2000, então trabalhando sobretudo sobre as recomposições de redes e de significados no Brasil, com pesquisas de outras redes feitas pela competição entre elites norte-americanas e elites europeias, que é o caso do Yves Desalé, que vem trabalhando há muito tempo sobre essa competição, Estados Unidos e Europa, e como se projeta, e ele vai desenvolver isso. O Michel Leferlet, que tem trabalhado extremamente sobre as elites políticas francesas, mas em particular, num momento mais recente, sobre as representações do empresariado francês e como há mudanças profundas nos últimos tempos, e o Gustavo Sorra, que vem trabalhando sobre a relação entre o universo editorial e o universo político dentro da América Latina, e vai poder pegar aqui um caso altissimamente significativo, que é de uma das mais importantes casas editoras latino-americanas, que é a Fundo de Cultura Econômica. Bom, e para dar a prova, tudo bem, e para mostrar como isso se aplica ao Brasil, nós teremos então um fechamento com a Letícia Canedo, com as elites mineiras. Não, tudo bem. Então, é só isso mesmo. Eu passo logo a palavra para o Luiz, que seria esse o desafio, de ver a questão empiricamente, como se pode estudar transformações do campo de poder mundializado.
Well, Daniel once described this project as from Minas to the world. And obviously, I'm not very good at talking about Minas, so I'm going to talk about the world. And this fits more or less my interest, since for the last 15 years, I've been exploring an avenue of research opened by Pierre Bourdieu and Monique de Saint-Martin, which they described as the internationalization of the market for the reproduction of national elite. And since it is very obviously a very big topic, I did this research with an American colleague, and we decided to focus on what is an essential aspect of this internationalization, that means American hegemony, and more precisely the side of American hegemony which is symbolical imperialism. Symbolical imperialism, what does that mean? That means exporting state expertise, exporting political ideology in order to try to influence the selection and the training of new national elites. And that fits perfectly into the project described by Laetitia and Afranio. But it fits also this avenue, because let me remind you that ANPOX was largely created under the incentive and the funding of the Ford Foundation, which is the main institution for this strategy of symbolical imperialism. So, I'm not here to denounce, but I'm here to try to show to you how you can use this avenue in order to understand precisely what is our topic here, that means the internationalization of national elites. And basically, what we did is try to bring together two streams of sociology, sort of international political sociology, focusing on hegemonic battles, or more precisely, the competition between old and new imperial powers, Europe and the US, and also another dimension which is absolutely essential and are completely linked, which was called by Andrew Abbott as church battle. That means the different professional groups and also the different fractions of the national elite and the state elite, which are competing for expanding their territories, but also for reshaping the state institutions to fit their interest and the interest of their clients. So we started this work something like 15 years ago by focusing on Latin America and the construction of the Washington Consensus, and its reformulation later into this so-called good governance. And we focused on mainly two aspects, human rights and the Chicago Boys, the Chile coup. I'm not going to talk about that because it's well known, and most of you probably know more about this than I do. But it remains at the end of this result, which was published at the Internationalization of Paris War, a big question: was this a specific Latin American phenomenon, or was it something bigger? And so, in the last 6-7 years, we have tried to explore more in depth the history of the construction of American imperialism and its latest transformation, not just in Latin America, but all over the world, and more precisely in Asia. So what I will offer you here is something based on the early genesis of American imperialism as moral imperialism, and its later subsequent transformation into Cold War strategy, or into now the new NGO public governance ideas. And this is a big project based on 10 years of work, probably close to 100 interviews, so it fits into the empirical category that Laetitia described. But at the same time, obviously, I don't have the time to present this in detail. So I want to start with an early warning about what this is not, in spite of what it might look like, some sort of misinterpretation. I'm talking about a world perspective, but be careful, this is not a world system theory, so because, first, it's a circular process, it's a two-way process. I will insist again and again on the fact that this circulation of ideas and people is not just from the core to the periphery, but the periphery serves as a laboratory for the fighting within the core. And you can find an example of that in Chile, but also in India and elsewhere. The second point I want to stress is that those empires are divided empires, and they have also divided colonies, as Steinmetz did show in a recent issue of Actes de la Recherche. So it's a very complex battle line which have echoes in the north and in the south, and it's precisely around these echoes that we build our hypothesis by looking at what Bourdieu calls homology, but neo-institutionalists called isomorphism, looking at precisely how different groups, both in the North and in the South, can help each other, construct each other, and construct what they export, what they import, but also the representation of what is being made in the South. Again, I want to stress that these homologies are not something given. They are social constructions. And indeed, the key American strategy during the World War was making friends. That means trying to create outside of the U.S. borders people that looked or acted almost as if they were American agents. And the fact that this association meeting resembles very much an American meeting is part of this strategy. But again, the last word I want to stress is these battle lines are very fuzzy in the sense that the core agents of these battles are, most of them, double agents. They start their life as agents of colonial administration, and then they reappear as fathers of independence. And I can give you hundreds of examples of those people. More precisely, they're not just double agents in terms of national identity, they're double agents in terms of political strategy. That means we'll finish by showing you some of these corporate lawyers who are also present themselves as champions of civil society, and we can also find the other aspects of that, and Laetitia has studied some of them, people who started as political activists and end up as very traditional politicians. So my presentation will be based on focusing on three moments, trying to explain, since I don't have the time to provide a whole history, a couple of paradoxes, and end up with a problem. The paradox is why American imperialism started as a moral imperialism, mainly based on lawyer statesmen in the US and lawyer protégés in the South. The second paradox is why, when this strategy was expanded by the very people, the same group that invented it in the Philippines, when it was expanded as the Cold War strategy, it completely transformed its set of alliance in the sense that it provoked the demise of the lawless protégé, and they were replaced by a whole new alliance, well known here and elsewhere, military regime and their economic technocrats. And the last puzzle is, and this is a phenomenon that we can see both in Latin America and in Asia with different momentum and different times, but very similar. And the last question, if I have time to reach it, is why you find huge dissimilarities in Latin America and in Asia in regard to the last stage of this strategy, when NGOs are now in the forefront of political transformation, as we could see in Indonesia with Reformasi, or in Eastern Europe with the various NGOs in Georgia and elsewhere, helped and subsidized by the Soros Foundation. So basically, the first step, the genesis of this moral imperialism. Why? Because, and it's a story which has some echo, I hope, with what is happening now, when the Americans arrived as an army in the Philippines to so-called help the locals, they quickly made a mess, as we know they can do in Iraq and elsewhere. And so after a few years of this resistance, the President McKinley said, well, we are going to call in people who are very much part of what was called at that time in the U.S. an anti-imperialist league, because remember, the U.S. was a colonial nation, a colonized nation. And so they called to head this new policy in the Philippines people who were part of this group of anti-colonizers. And the strategy they invented, since they were lawyers, were a strategy based more or less on law and clientelism. That means they, as all the all the empires everywhere, recruited natives as protégés. And they transformed these natives who were, the ilustrados, the sons of the wealthy landowners, into lawyers. And not just into lawyers, but into lawyers linked to very close fraternities, which was a way to control the power and distribute the power between themselves. And the resource, the recipe for this state was what till now is called guns, guns, and law. Guns, because in order to win the election, you need to have guns, and goods to push and force the people who are you control to vote for you in the elections, and then law to both defend these gunmen when they are being challenged in court, but more importantly later to organize the state as a way to as a source of patronage and then as a source of profitable monopoly in trade or in finance. And this is what was described by Ichprat as booty capitalism. And this might sound very odd as a recipe, but let me tell you, it has been immensely successful. A century later, it is still the same group of families and still very much the same regime which controls the Philippines. And what is interesting is that this success in the South was also the source of success in the North, because the people who invented this strategy, people like Elihu Root, who were, mercenaries for the robber barons, made a tremendous career. Taft, after being the Governor General of the Philippines, became Chief of the Supreme Court in the U.S. and then President of the U.S. Elihu Root, who was the Secretary of War for McKinley, became later Secretary of State, and he ended up with the Nobel Prize for being one of the grandfathers of international law and international peace and the League of Nations. More important, you see that these people shaped for almost a whole century American politics and American state, in the sense that they created a sort of club, an elite club, called the Foreign Policy Establishment, which has been in control of U.S. politics almost to the end of the Vietnam War. And it is this very same group that you can trace. It's not an invention of social scientists. You can see that Elihu Root had a pupil who was Simpson. Simpson was the key architect of the war effort for the U.S. And Simpson had also a pupil who was McCloy, who was called the sort of shadow Secretary of State. So it's really the same group which has controlled and imposed the same strategy, a strategy invented in the Philippines and then expanded as a Cold War strategy. So now I come to the second paradox, which is you have this group in the U.S. who is immensely successful into shaping U.S. colonial policies in the Philippines, and then use this success to expand it into Cold War strategy, using exactly the same recipe, making friends, taking protégés, and training these protégés as professionals. And yet, it's a complete turnaround. It's both a continuity and a discontinuity, in the sense that we know that the main aspect of this Cold War strategy was getting rid of the lawyers and replacing these lawyers by a new alliance, military regime, and economic technocrats. So why is that? Very clearly, because the U.S. didn't invent this policy in the Philippines, they just replicated what had been done by the Great Britain, by Germany and France, all over the world. That is, in all of these colonial strategies, lawyers were the key agents of colonization, and lawyers were a co-opted national elite, used not so much to make law or to serve in courts, but to be politicians. They were educated as protégés and future politicians for these countries. And as a result, once they got into power after independence, they, as Nehru accused his peers, prolonged the constitution. That means they used all their resources. That means their resources or their entry into politics and the state, and also their knowledge of law and the courts to advance the interests of their clients, which meant that almost generally everywhere they were reactionaries, opposing very strongly developmental state or agrarian reform. But they were at the same time weak reactionaries in the sense that they were not willing to use state coercion in order to defend against the communist strategy. So at the same time, this is from the south. In the north, and more quickly, you have you can look at the system of provision and see that the Chicago boys were not the first money doctors sent in the South. This is something which going back also to the origin of American colonialism. At the same time as they were sending lawyers and training lawyers in the Philippines, they invented what was called at that time dollar diplomacy. Dollar diplomacy, saying that trade and investment were tools far more efficient than military and army in order to control dominated countries in the South. And so this strategy was also a way to control, to use as a counterfire, the tendencies of these lawyers, these states, to be populist, that means to spend too much, and so they were therefore to control the finance of these countries. And this now, and I will probably finish on that, one tends to look at and we did that too, when we look at the Chicago and the Chile coup, to focus on the ideology, the paradigm, neoliberalism. But probably this is a mistake that social scientists tend to do. They tend to take too much seriously the content of this knowledge, because it's interesting to see that at the same time as the Ford Foundation was subsidizing and helping the Chicago professors to establish in Chile, they were pushing another group called the Berkeley Mafia. I didn't invent the term, that's how they call themselves, in Jakarta. And these people were not neoliberals, they were good straight Keynesians. They were into developmental economics. And what is interesting is that, of course, they follow the same strategy, being in alliance with Suharto. And what is interesting is when you see what happens to these people later, you find that they do exactly like the lawyers that they replaced. Because these economists in Indonesia, they were as much diplomats, even serving as ambassadors or minister of foreign affairs, than they were technocrats. Because, they were the only ones who knew how to speak English and had some entry into the US. They were also political brokers between the different factions, in that case, the army and the Chinese diaspora. And last but not least, they became very quickly consultants and even entrepreneurs. And the son from the founder of this Berkeley Mafia married into the Suharto family and became one of the capitalists, crony capitalists around Suharto. So the last point is the puzzle. Why the new evolution is very different in the US and in Latin America and in Asia. And very quickly, I give you the key of that, is one tends to think that these moments were the beginning of the rise of economists and technocrats, and that lawyers were something of the past. That's not true, They are not dead, as I say, fortunately for me, because they are my favorite subject to study. But what you see is that they remain very strong as corporate brokers all over the world. The multinational law firms are one of the key agents of this global capitalism, but also a new breed of lawyers has emerged everywhere, which is the legal activists. And the legal activists are another completely different branch, particularly in Latin America. So you have a sort of divergence between the elite of the bar, which is doing corporate business and international corporate business, and these NGO lawyers activists. What is strange is if you look at Asia, suddenly you find that there is